Yeah. So now I'll go back to mumbling, now that you've said that it's loud enough. um, okay, so first just a quick overview of what we'll be talking about today and also what we actually talked about last week. So last week we started talking about machine learning, and we talked about this difference between supervised learning on the one hand and unsupervised learning on the other, where supervised learning was the setup where the learner is given labeled training examples to learn from, whereas unsupervised learning we described as this more sort of process of self-organization, where the algorithm isn't given any labeled training data to learn from. And the last lecture we stuck to supervised learning. We'll continue to talk about supervised learning for the first part today, and then we'll turn to unsupervised learning. Okay, but so last time we talked about basically two different classifiers, Rocchio classification and k-nearest neighbor classification. And both of these are classifiers that sort of build on this vector space representation of our data. So we could call them vector space classifiers. And we also spent some time talking about different ways of representing classes. So up until last time, we had only talked about how to represent sort of individual observations or objects in our vector space model. But last week we talked about how to represent classes and also how to represent class membership. Various functions describing how a given object belongs to different classes. And lastly, we spent some time when we talked about problems in relation to the Rocchio classifier. We talked about various issues related to different class distributions and how the class regions within a vector space could have different shapes, where some of them are maybe are less ideal for applying Rocchio classification. And most importantly, in that respect, we talked about this distinction between linearly separable classes and non-linearly separable classes. And as you hopefully remember, Rocchio was we saw that was a linear classifier, and then we turned to the k-nearest neighbor classifier, which is a non-linear classifier. So the one thing we didn't talk about the last time was how to evaluate these classifiers. Once we've built a classifier and applied it, we'd like to be able to say something about how well it works. So that's what we'll spend some time on at the beginning of today's lecture, and then after that we'll turn to talk about unsupervised learning, and more specifically this family of methods known as clustering. Clustering methods. So these are techniques where we still have the same goal of modeling classes of objects or modeling groups of objects in a vector space, but now without having the luxury of labeled training examples to start from. Okay, and we'll talk about the difference between flat clustering and hierarchical clustering, and we'll mostly be dealing with so-called flat clustering today, and hierarchical clustering will mostly be the topic of the next lecture again. And somewhere in between here we'll have time for a quick vector space quiz to see how much has stuck from the last two lectures. Okay, so testing a classifier. So we saw last time that when in the context of these vector space classifiers, at least that we've been dealing with, the task of classification can be seen as the task of finding these boundaries that separate the class regions in our vector space. Okay, we refer to these class regions defined by the classifier as the decision boundaries, because depending on what side of this boundary a given test object falls, that decides what class label we will assign. But now we'd like to be able to evaluate this boundary. So here in this illustration we see a class boundary has been drawn up, but this could have been drawn up in sort of infinite possible different ways. And we'd like to be able to objectively sort of quantify how well a given decision boundary defined by a classifier works. And the quick answer as to how to do that is basically just to apply the classifier and then count how many mistakes we made, right? But there are many different ways to do the counting, and many different ways to sort of set up a test experiment. But one important thing is that we'll need a test set. So last time we only talked about the training data. So the labeled examples were given to estimate a classifier. But now we'd like to apply the classifier that we've trained and see how well it does. So for that we need what is usually referred to as a held out test set. And the reason we sort of emphasize held out is that it's an important methodological point that we keep sort of our model tuning and model training separate from the final testing of the classifier in order to get a representative measure of how well the classifier performs. And the test data that we use for testing and applying a classifier is sometimes referred to as a gold standard, because the test data must, like for the training data, it must include labels that tells us what class assignments are actually the correct ones, because without that we're unable to evaluate. We need to know the what is the truth, what is the gold truth. So if we didn't have a held out test set, so if you try to imagine what would happen if we trained the KNN classifier, for example, for k equals 1, so one nearest neighbor classifier. And then we basically just took the training data and gave that to the classifier. What would be the result? Can anyone immediately see the outcome of? Very good. Yeah, it would be perfect, basically, because the classifier would have sort of seen all the objects that we ask it to classify, right, from before. A 1NN classifier would have stored the entire set of the entire training set. So when given an object, it will just compare and find an identical copy of that item in the training set and assign it the same class label. So it would get a perfect score, but it wouldn't tell us anything about how it would expect that classifier to generalize to new unseen data. So it's completely unrealistic. So methodologically, it's very important to have sort of this clean division between the data that we use for training and also developing and tuning a classifier on the one hand, and then a reserved held out test set that we use for evaluation. Okay, so we'll sort of spend a couple of slides very quickly imagine that we've trained a classifier and that we're now ready to apply it to a test set. And then we'll look at different ways of how to quantify the performance of that classifier. So here we have a classifier. We don't really need to say anything about precisely what type of classifier this is. But what is shown here is meant to correspond to the training data. So we have two classes with a fairly traditional setup in sort of two-class classification, where we have one large majority class, which are the circles here, which will be what we refer to as the negative class. And then it's the positive class is shown by the green triangles here, which is also the minority class, which is a fairly typical setup that we have when training a two-class classifier. So for the sake of the example, we can imagine that this is a spam filter, for example. And we see that it's a linear classifier, not that it really matters, but the line here is supposed to show the decision boundary. Okay, so in the training data, the green triangles here will correspond to emails that have been labeled as spam, and the red circles are emails that have been labeled as non-spam, ordinary, legitimate emails. Okay, and then we're given some test data. So the test data, the test objects, the new unseen emails that we present to our classifier that it hasn't seen before corresponds to the X's that we see here. And here, sort of visually, we immediately see on what side of the decision boundary that these test objects fall on, right? But in practice, this would be the result of computing some decision function by the classifier. So if this was a Rocky O classifier, for example, we'd have one centroid for the spam email, one centroid for the regular emails, and we would, for each of these X's, compute the distance to the two centroids, and based on that, decide whether to label it spam or non-spam. Okay, but here we see it visually immediately on what side of the decision boundary the cross lands. Okay, but so this is, since this is to be regarded as gold standard test data, you actually know that what is the true labels, and we'll show that by adding color. So any X now colored green means that in the gold data it was labeled as spam. If it's red, it's labeled as belonging to the majority class, non-spam. Okay, and now we'll see how each of these sort of predictions made by our classifier, that these can be wrong or correct in different ways. And that corresponds to these categories that we see at the bottom here. So we'll start with what is called true positives. So in this case, this would correspond to the lonely item on top here, labeled TP. So that's a true positive. So that would be an example of something to be excited about when we apply our classifier. So this is an example of something that the classifier got right. This would be something that our gold standard labels as spam and that our classifier correctly predicted to be spam. And then there's one type of error we can do called false positives. So a false positive would be something that here happens to be filed in our spam folder, but it's actually a legitimate ordinary email. This would be a false positive, sometimes also called a type 1 error. And then there's another type of error we can make, so-called type 2 errors or false negatives. So these would be examples of something that is actually spam, that is labeled as spam in our gold data, but that our classifier ended up predicting to be ordinary email. So that's a false negative. And then finally, it's the second way that a classifier can be correct, namely the true negatives. So these are all the emails that our classifier thought were non-spam, and that also happened to be non-spam, that were correctly predicted to be to not be spam by our classifier. Okay, so based on these sort of four categories for quantifying in different ways that predictions can be wrong or correct, we can now define different performance measures. And the first is what is called accuracy. So here, this is just the same diagram that you saw on the previous page with all the true positive, false positives, false negatives, all these labels assigned. So what the accuracy measure does, it basically just quantifies the number of correct predictions. So you see it sums the true positives and the true negatives and divides that by the total number of predictions that were made. So in our case, we have 10 test items, and if we count, we find that 7 of them are actually correct predictions. It's the sum of the true negatives and the true positives. That would give us an accuracy of 0.0. And sort of immediately, that sounds fairly good, I guess. 0.7 doesn't sound too bad. But in order to make that judgment, we need some kind of reference. And in reality, accuracy is a measure that works. It can work well for classification problems where we have sort of balanced classes. So the two classes that we want to try to separate have sort of roughly equal number of members. But in a more typical case like here, where we have sort of skewed classes, where one is a clear minority class and the other is a majority class, the accuracy measure actually is not all that well suited. So if we imagine here, what would be a good baseline classifier? So by baseline, I mean sort of a simple classifier that we can imagine that sets sort of the lower bound for what we want to expect that our classifier should perform better than. So here, for example, the easiest thing we could do probably is just to say that we'll just assign the majority class to all our tests, to all our test examples. We won't try to do anything intelligent. We won't even look at the data. We'll just say that this is all non-spam. That's the majority class. That makes sense. It's without any other information, a given email has a higher chance of being non-spam. And if we applied that simple sort of majority class baseline here, we would end up with the same accuracy of 0.7. We would then lose the one true positive up there, but the false positive would now count as a true negative. So that would even out, and we would still end up with the same accuracy. So in that sense, it's clear that an accuracy of 0.7 isn't actually all that impressive. So there are two other measures that are typically used in cases like this, where we have sort of unbalanced classes, and that's precision and recall. So precision basically counts how many of the positive predictions that were made were actually correct. So we would quantify, when you look in your spam folder, how many of the emails that happen to go in your spam folders, in your spam folder, is actually spam. Whilst recall, on the other hand, looks at how many of the actual spam messages in the test data that we managed to correctly identify. And if you compute this for our data set here, we see that we end up with a precision of 0.5 and a recall of 0.33. So immediately we see that these are sort of less forgiving evaluation measures in this context. And it's also important to realize that there's a sort of a trade-off here between precision and recall. So we could easily obtain sort of higher recall, but at the price of precision. And it's typically also the case that, depending on what we want to use the classifier for, we might care more about one or the other. So for our spam filter example, we probably care about both precision and recall. But let's say we had the classifier that had the task of identifying, to help us identify cancer diagnosis, for example. Something that took in tissue samples, and we wanted to classify whether there was a chance of cancer being present. Then suddenly recall would be much more important to us than precision, because okay, maybe there would be some of our positive predictions that turned out to be sort of a false alarm, but we certainly wouldn't want to have many cases where someone actually had cancer, but we failed to correctly predict that it was a risk of cancer. Well, in other settings, as say information retrieval setup, for example, where we want a classifier to identify relevant documents for a query, then probably precision is what we care more about. We're interested in, so when you search something on Google, you don't necessarily care about getting all the relevant documents for what you search for, but you certainly would like that what is presented to you at the first page, that those are actually relevant. Okay, there's also a measure called the F-score, which combines precision and recall. That balances these two measures into one single score. Okay, this basically just sums up all the comments that I just made about the different evaluation measures. It's just you have that in the lecture notes for reference later. Okay, so far we've talked about evaluating sort of two class problems, so spam or non-spam. But often we have sort of several classes. We have a multi-class problem. We want the classifier to distinguish between several class labels. And then we need some way of coming up with a single score that represents how well our classifier did across all the different classes. And there are basically two different approaches. One is called macro averaging and one is called micro averaging. So for macro averaging, what we do is basically just sum the precision and recall these aggregated performance measures that we've computed for each individual class, and then compute an average of those. Okay, so one problem with this macro average is that will be we'll tend to overemphasize the results that we get on small classes, because all the precision and recall figures will sort of contribute just as much to the average here, regardless of the size of the class. And the size of the class again reflects the number of predictions that the classifier has made. So the macro average will tend to be overly influenced by the small classes in our data. Again, if the classes are balanced, it doesn't really matter, but typically they're not. And then the other averaging approach is called the micro average. And instead of summing these aggregated precision and recall figures, it sums the actual counts of true positives, false positives, and so on, computed for each individual class, and computes a global average based on those instead, or computes the precision and recall, for example, based on those counts instead. Well, this will have the opposite tendency, that it will tend to be overly influenced by the large classes, for the obvious reason that we're now looking at sort of these counting the individual predictions, and there will be more of those for the large classes than the small classes. So often if you have very unbalanced classes and it's not entirely clear which one of these will be the best one, which is typically the case, you might end up seeing people reporting both. Okay, that mostly sums up the very quick and brief tour of classifier evaluation that we wanted to talk about. Then I just thought I'd spend 2 slides about the next assignment. So we talked briefly about that at the previous lecture as well. Then we saw this slide. So the next assignment will be out tomorrow. And as we mentioned the last time, it will build on the previous assignment 2A that is due tonight, where you've been building these vector space representations for a set of words, 122 words, based on these bag of word features extracted from a sample of the Brown corpus. So the thing we'll add one of the things we'll add for 2B is that we'll add class labels for most of these words, but not all of them. And then the goal is to train a Rockwell classifier to try to correctly predict the class labels for a remaining set of unlabeled words. All of these words will be taken from that set of 122 words in that word list that you were given for 2A. these are the class labels that you'll be given: food, institution, title, place name, person name. And then you'll be giving a set of examples for each of these labels as your training data, and then you'll then need to compute centroids representing all of these classes: a food centroid, institution centroid, title centroid, and so on. And then based on the distance between these centroids and the feature vectors for these remaining unlabeled words, you'll need to then assign the corresponding class labels. So that'll be one part of the next assignment. And also note that as I said, it will build on the previous assignment 2A. And we will actually provide a sample solution for assignment 2A, so that if some of you had problems to fully implement what we asked for in 2A, we will provide a sample solution so that you can all sort of start from the same level and build on that. But the sample solution won't be provided until after the weekend or on Sunday. I guess we'll make that available. That's because some students have asked for a 3-day extension due to illness. So we need to wait before we give that out. But you'll still be given an additional 2 weeks to complete the assignment once that pre-code is distributed. So you'll get slightly more time on this assignment than the previous one. And then one additional thing that you'll be asked to do for this assignment is to compute something called a proximity matrix. So a proximity matrix is something we'll get back to when we talk about hierarchical clustering in the next lecture. But what that is basically for a given set of m objects in a vector space. So for example, the 122 words in your vector space model. A proximity matrix would be an m by m matrix, 122 by 122 matrix in your case, storing all the distances or the proximities, since we're using the dot product, which is a proximity measure, not a distance measure. That stores all these proximity values for all the different pairs of objects in the space. So for a given proximity matrix R, an element ij, a given cell in that matrix, will in your case correspond to the dot product of word I and word j. So you'll be asked to define such a proximity matrix and to compute that and store that for the vector space that you've already created. And one thing to immediately note is that given that our similarity measure is typically symmetric, like the dot product is symmetric, so if you let sim here be the dot product and you apply that to x and y, you'll get the same result as if you apply it to y and x. The order doesn't matter. So note that also means that this proximity matrix can be regarded as being symmetric. And this has consequences for the data structure that we choose for representing this matrix, and also how we compute it. Because if we've computed and stored the value for I and j, we already know the value for j and I, since that will be the same. So that's something to try to take account for when you implement your proximity matrix. Okay, and once we've stored such a proximity matrix, that can be used in several applications. So one thing is that it will often provide the inputs to many clustering methods, specifically these hierarchical clustering methods that we'll talk about later. But another more immediately relevant thing for us is that it gives us quick access to computing sort of ranked lists of nearest neighbors in our vector space. So by just sorting these row elements for a given row in the similarity matrix, so a given row will represent all the similarities that a given word has to all the other words in the vector space, right? So once you have that matrix, we can quickly then get a ranked list of what the closest words are for a given target word. So that's the second thing we'll ask you to do after you've implemented the proximity matrix is then, based on that, we'll ask you to implement functionality for quickly retrieving ranked lists of nearest neighbor relations in the space. Okay, I think that's all I wanted to say about the assignment. I was wondering whether we now actually have time to do a quiz even before the break, or if that would be too little time. But I think probably we will have time, and if we end up stealing some time for the break, we can just postpone the break but make that longer. So hopefully most of you have a tablet or a laptop or a smartphone with a browser. Let's see. Okay, so this is where we left off. We had just briefly talked about the new assignment 2B coming out tomorrow, and then we had the quiz, and then now we're ready to move on to sort of the other main topic for today, which is to turn to clustering. So there are basically two main sort of tasks in machine learning related to dealing with categories of data. So one is classification, which we've dealt with today in the previous lecture. So what we called labeled, supervised learning, so learning from labeled training examples. So with clustering, we're still interested in modeling groups or sets of objects within our data, but this time we don't start from labeled training examples. We start from raw unlabeled data. And then the goal is to just automatically try to identify subgroups within the data. Try to automatically discover sort of structure that is inherent in the data without us manually sort of pointing our finger towards what type of structure or what type of groups, what type of classes that we're after. We want that to just sort of fall out of the data and the algorithm automatically. So clustering can be understood as some kind of self-organization, if you will. So when reading technical things, technical descriptions of what the objective is with clustering, thanks. Service. It's often described as that we want to find groups where we maximize homogeneity and minimizing heterogeneity. So a very complicated formal way of stating sort of our intuitions about the properties of something forming a group, right? We want the groups that we identify to correspond to regions where we have several objects that are closely positioned together, while we want the distances between these groups to be as far as possible, right? That sort of goes well with our intuitions about what a group of data points should correspond to. Just quickly, some examples where cluster analysis is where that can immediately be useful, or where that is used. So one place where it's often used is for sort of a first stage in data analysis. So we call it exploratory data analysis. So typically when we're at a stage where we just want to try to find out what, if any, structure is in our data set at all. Clustering is used much within the field of information retrieval. So there are many sort of possible use cases that we could set up here, but one immediate obvious way in how we could use clusters is that if we've run clustering and we have defined a set of clusters, we have defined a set of subgroups of objects within our data. So in this case, that would be sort of groups of documents, right, within a document collection. Then if we're given a search query, we could speed up our search process here by first retrieving what is the most relevant cluster. So a cluster could, for example, be represented by its centroid, right? So all the questions that we've discussed earlier with regards to how to represent classes still apply here. So we could then maybe retrieve the most relevant cluster, and then from within that, the documents within that cluster, we try to do a more fine-grained ranking in terms of what are the most relevant documents. It's also used sometimes for presenting the actual search results. So Google actually used to include that as what was it called back when they've taken it away? I think it was called something like Wheel of Fortune or something non-obvious that you could click on after you had searched, where it would show you, instead of just a ranked list of documents, it would show you sort of subgroups of the documents with labels or keywords describing roughly what the different groups of documents that it had retrieved corresponded to. Dimensionality reduction is another very important application area of using clustering. Alternatively, we could view dimensionality reduction here as the task of using what we call class-based features. So let's use the semantic space problem you've been working on for your assignment 2A as an example. So there, your features correspond to individual words right within the sentence. You have a bag of words using a bag of words model. Now, let's say we had actually run clustering on this data set, and we had identified subgroups of words that seem to correspond to clusters within the data. So we would find, for example, hopefully that things like milk and water and beer and wine, all of these would maybe fall into the same cluster, as they would all have somewhat similar features, and that cluster would somehow sort of represent a more abstract conceptual category, corresponding to the loosely corresponding to the label food, for example, that you'll be given for assignment 2B. So once we had done clustering and formed an idea of these groups within the data, we could now imagine creating this vector space model that you created for 2A all over again. Except at this time, instead of having features corresponding to individual words, we could now have features corresponding to these clusters that we found. So when in your context, so in a given sentence, when you see the word milk, instead of adding a feature corresponding to that unique word type, you would add a feature corresponding to the cluster containing words such as water, milk, beer, wine, and what have you. So this would in effect give us feature vectors with a much smaller dimension, lower dimensionality, while at the same time also encoding knowledge about the contextual distributions of our words that is more, in a sense, more general. We're not just looking at these unique word types, we're instead recording information about more abstract classes of words. Okay, so this is one important use of cluster analysis within natural language processing, at least. This is how we often see clustering used in practice in NLP. Okay, there's also a bunch of other use cases that we could list for cluster analysis, such as trying to automatically discover topic classes for documents, and many others. I don't think I'll go into all the examples here, but now you have sort of an idea. Okay, there are broadly speaking, two main families of clustering methods. It's the hierarchical methods, which end up creating not just a set of groups, but sets of nested groups of the data that together form a tree. So with one very general, all-encompassing group at the top, and then more and more fine-grained groups as we go down the tree all the way down to the individual objects at the bottom of the tree. That's what we'll be talking about for the next lecture. But for today, we'll talk about the other main category of clustering methods, known as flat clustering. They're also sometimes known as partitional clustering methods. And here, we don't build this sort of tree structure of nested partitions or clusterings. We instead try to just directly decompose the data into subgroups. Okay, so that's what we'll be dealing with for the rest of this lecture. So first, I'll be describing flat clustering sort of from a very high level perspective, and then it'll probably seem a bit vague. Then maybe it will seem a bit formal, but then finally, we'll be walking through an actual clustering algorithm where we'll see that it's actually very simple what's going on. So k-means is the clustering methods that we'll end up looking more at in detail. So very generally speaking, the aim with a flat clustering method is that we're given a set of objects O here, and then we want to assign each of those objects to some cluster. I've used the same subscript here on both the object and the cluster C. That should be a J for the C here. And the parameters typically to our clustering method is the cardinality. That is the number of clusters that we want to find, the number of groups that we want to discover in the data, and also the similarity function that we want to use for measuring the similarity between objects. Okay, so formally what we want to do is that we want to define some sort of assignment, a function gamma that maps a set of objects into a set of clusters, a set of categories. And we want to do that in such a way that it optimizes some defined function f here of that partitioning. And we'll later look at more specifically what this function f, this objective function, can be. But in general terms, what we want to optimize for is what we said earlier regarding homogeneity and heterogeneity. We have high intra-cluster similarity and low inter-cluster similarity. So again, sounds very formal and technical, but again, it actually describes just our intuitions about what a group is, right? It's high inter-cluster similarity just means that the points that fall within a cluster, that fall within a group, we want those to be as similar as possible. Whereas we want low inter-cluster similarity, that means that we want the similarity between the different clusters to be as low as possible. Right, that makes sense. Okay, so these flat clustering approaches can be seen as on the one hand an optimization problem. So we want to optimize this mapping function according to some objective function. We can also view them as sort of search problems. So for a given set of objects, there will be a finite number of possible ways to partition that data. So a sort of naive, brute force, straightforward solution here could be to just compute all these possible partitionings of the data, all possible assignments gamma, and then just apply our objective function to all of them and pick the best one. Just rank them and pick the one that seems to be best according to whatever criterion f we have here for evaluating our clustering in terms of intercluster and intra-cluster similarity. But of course, this won't work in practice because there are exponentially many ways to define clusters over a set of objects, and exponentially many ways to partition the data. So instead, flat clustering algorithms are typically based on some approximation, where we start with some initial partitioning, often just random partitioning, and then iteratively try to improve on that partitioning until we've reached some kind of stopping criterion. And in every step, hopefully moving closer to optimizing for this objective function f. Okay, so finally, that was just very, very high level general about flat clustering methods, just very broadly speaking. Now we'll turn to k-means as an actual example of such a flat clustering algorithm. And k-means can actually be seen as sort of an unsupervised version of the nearest centroid classifier, the Rocchio classifier. So the goal with the k-means algorithm is to define a number of k clusters in such a way that each object within our collection belongs to the cluster that has the nearest centroid. So I mean, that's very similar to how we define Rocchio classification, right? But the main difference, obviously, is that with the Rocchio classifier, the centroids are given. Not directly, but they're given in terms of the labeled training data. This time, the centroids are not given. We need to ourselves find the best centroids to represent these k clusters. And in terms of framing k-means as an optimization problem, the particular objective function f that we'll be optimizing for in this case is known as the within cluster sum of squares. So you see what we do here is we sum over all the clusters in our partition and for all objects within each cluster, and then compute the distance, the Euclidean distance between the object and the centroid. And this within cluster sum of squares measure is equivalent to just minimizing the distance between the centroids and the members of each cluster. That's sort of the intuitive way to look at what we're doing here. So the centroids is sort of a representative of the class, and the smaller the distance between the members within the class is to the centroid, the better that centroid can be said to represent the class. Okay, so it remains we have yet to define sort of the actual algorithm here. So how do we achieve this? How do we, okay, fine, this is the objective function that we want to optimize for. We want to find a partition that maximizes this value. How do we do that? And that's actually turns out to be very straightforward, very simple algorithm. So it has three main steps. So one is to initialize the clustering, to come up with this first random partitioning of the of our space, because we don't have any other information. We don't have any predefined classes, so we start by just a random partitioning, and that will be defined as defining an initial set of just random centroids, what we call seeds. So we'll pick k seeds to initialize our clustering. And then we will iteratively assign all objects within our space to the nearest centroid, and then we will recompute the centroid based on all the examples that are closest to that centroid in the space. Then we'll reassign all objects again to clusters based on the centroid distance, and we'll iteratively do this reassignment of objects and recomputing the centroids until we meet some kind of stopping criterion. We'll look at an illustration in the next slide where we see more visually sort of what goes on when we apply the algorithm. But a couple of things to note first is that we're guaranteed that this within cluster sum of squares criterion is monotonically decreasing from iteration to iteration, and we're guaranteed that the algorithm will converge, but it's not guaranteed that we will actually find the global minimum. Let's go through, and so this is again an example from the Manning-Rogovan-Schütze textbook that shows what goes on when we apply the k-means clustering. So the top left here, it's the initialization of the method. So here we pick these seeds that we will use to represent our centroids. So this is for k equals 2, so k being the number of clusters that we want to find. K is not the nearest neighbors now, but the number of classes that we want to find. And there are different ways that we could in which we could choose these initial seeds. We could just pick some examples from our collection at random. We could pick some points within the space at random without those points necessarily corresponding to actual objects. We could pick a number of points or a number of examples for each k and then compute a centroid based on those points. Sometimes people apply an entirely different clustering algorithm first, as a first pass, to define these initial seeds, and then they start k-means. So the k-means clustering algorithm in itself is quite simple, but a lot of effort, a lot of creativity goes into how to best pick these initial seeds that we start from, because that can have a large impact on the final clustering. Given that we're not guaranteed to find sort of the globally best partitioning. Okay, so but here we've picked 2 seeds. This will correspond to our centroids in the first iteration. Then we move on to the next picture here, where we assign points in our collection to the nearest centroid. Now, after that assignment has been made, we recompute our centroids. So this step will correspond to basically what we do when we apply the Rockwell classifier. Each point in our document will now be assigned to the centroid that is closest to it. That is now taken to correspond to our groups in this iteration, and we recompute the centroids for the members that have now been assigned to the class. Then we would go back to this assignment step in the top right here. Assign documents again, and then recompute the centroids and so on. So in practice, the centroids will sort of float around in the space, and as more iterations go by, they will sort of slow down, and once the algorithm converges, they will stop moving entirely and be fixed somewhere in the space. And in terms of stopping this algorithm, we could either just define the stopping criterion could be a predefined number of iterations, or it could be looking at whether the objective function is unchanged between iteration, or whether the centroids are unchanged between iterations. There are several different ways that we could define our stopping criterion for when we think that the partitioning is sort of good enough. I think I've said everything here already. One thing to note, maybe in terms of seeds, is that just like when working with the Rockwell classifier, sort of outliers can cause problems and can make the quality of the final partitioning deteriorate, because when we compute the centroids, if you have certain outlier points, sort of noise points that are in the peripheral of the space, they will sort of have an unproportional effect on the centroids and pull the centroids away from where they would sort of best represent the remaining class members. So outliers in the space, just like in Rockwell classification, is something we'd like to avoid when doing k-means clustering. The rest here are things I've said, but it's in the I've already said it, but you have it in the lecture notes for later. One other thing, some other variations of k-means worth mentioning. So one is k-medoids. Remember when we talked about how to represent classes in the previous lecture? We talked about these instance-based representations of classes. We said that medoids could be one variation. So instead of, like in KNN, letting all group members potentially represent the class, we pick a single member that seems to be more representative. Let that represent the class. So like a centroid, but with the difference that it would correspond to an actual class member, while a centroid as a prototype doesn't necessarily need to correspond to an actual example. Fuzzy c-means is another variation that works just like k-means is described here, but rather than assigning hard, crisp memberships to each cluster. So again, something we talked about in the previous lecture, right? These different ways to define memberships in a class. With fuzzy c-means, the memberships would be regarded as soft or graded, so that each object could be a member of every cluster with some value between 0 and 1. 1 meaning it's sort of fully regarded as a member of that cluster. Any other lower value meaning it's less associated with that cluster. We can then also still use the same objective function, the within cluster sum of squares, but then sort of weighting the contribution by each class member to the centroid based on its distance to the centroid. Just briefly, a couple of advantages and disadvantages with working with flat clustering methods in general and k-means specifically, is that these are they're simple methods. They may be not simple when you think of them as optimization problems, but when we think of them as we saw sort of what the actual k-means algorithm does, it's really it's conceptually simple. We can understand it sort of intuitively, and they're typically also efficient, linear in the number of objects to be clustered typically, while these hierarchical methods that we'll be dealing with in the next lecture are typically somewhat less efficient. One problem is that this seeding step, when we initialize the algorithm, is typically based on randomly setting these centroids, right? And this randomness means that the algorithm ends up being non-deterministic. So we could run k-means multiple times on exactly the same data, and we'd end up with different partitionings. So that could be a disadvantage in many settings. Another disadvantage is that we have to, in advance, specify or decide on this number k, the number of clusters that we want to find. And often there's no good way of sort of just knowing the number of clusters that we expect to be in the data. So often we need to sort of run it with different values of k and see what works best. Often the quality of the actual partition that we end up finding is often also regarded as being not as good as when using these slightly more expensive hierarchical methods. Okay, a couple of things before. So I've said sort of mostly what I wanted to say about k-means, but I just wanted to try to make some connections between the different methods that we talked about in this lecture and the previous lectures. So the last lecture we talked about Rocchio classification, nearest centroid classification, and we talked about the k-nearest neighbor classifier. And today we talked about this k-means clustering, and we've already mentioned how k-means clustering can be thought of as performing Rocchio classification, right, in each iteration step. So in each iteration, we have a set of centroids, and we then assign our objects in our collection to clusters based on this centroid distance. We sort of pretend that we have class information represented by these centroids. But also note that Rocchio classification in itself can actually be seen as an instance of performing k-nearest neighbor classification. So performing Rocchio classification can be thought of as doing one nearest neighbor classification with respect to the centroids. So we only compute these neighbor relations with respect to the centroids, not the other class members. We treat the centroids as our only data objects, and then we perform one nearest neighbor classification with respect to those. Does that sound weird to anyone? That we can make that state that equivalence? Because remember last time we said that KNN is a nonlinear classifier. And we said that Rocchio is a linear classifier. But now it seems clear that the Rocchio classifier is an instance of one nearest neighbor classification. So how does that make sense? So remember last time when we talked about this decision boundary defined for the KNN classifier, that was done in terms of this Voronoi tessellation, the Voronoi diagram. So this is the Voronoi diagram we looked at in the previous lecture, and the circles and the diamonds and the X's here corresponds to all our training examples. And for each example, or for each object in our collection, we define a cell, a convex polygon in the space, which is defined by in terms of all the points that are closest to that point compared to the other points. Okay, so everything within this within the given cell is closer to that example. And then we saw that how the class boundaries that the KNN classifier ends up defining is sort of drawn along the boundaries of these Voronoi cells for members of a given class. So this will be nonlinear, that decision boundary, but you see that locally for each Voronoi cell, it is actually linear. And if we turn to, so the diagram on the left here corresponds to what we looked at last time when we talked about the decision boundaries that are defined for the nearest centroid classifier. And here we talked about something very similar, right? So here we have 3 centroids defined, and we talked about how this decision boundary is defined in terms of the points that are closest to, that are equally close to 2 different centroids. So the points that are, the 3 points that are drawn on the line separating UK and the Kenya class are all points that are equally far away from the UK centroid and the Kenya centroid. And essentially what this is just the Voronoi tessellation for defined for these 3 points, the centroids. And since we only have sort of 1 point for each class, namely the centroid, and as we just talked about with the tessellation for KNN here, that is locally linear for each point, or for each class in this case. Okay, but just some sort of connections that are worth sort of bearing in mind when you um, when you read up on this later, I guess, for when you look back at the lecture notes later. Okay, that's all I wanted to cover for today. One important message that I've forgotten to mention so far, I guess, is that the next lecture will actually be cancelled, so we'll take a small break, and then the next lecture will be in 2 weeks from now. Many of you will maybe have a small fall break in between, høstferie. And in 2 weeks when we pick up, we will wrap up talking about clustering. So I will then finish talking about this other main category of clustering methods, namely hierarchical methods. And then Stefan will take over and we'll start talking about, we'll start with a crash course on probability theory and then go on to talk about how to model sequences of events, the likelihood of sequences of observations. Okay, see you in 2 weeks.